The man nobody saw. The man who built everything and owned nothing. She raised her glass to her sisters and laughed, a light, careless sound that floated over the crackling fire like she hadn't a single worry in the world. "I'll bleed his accounts dry," she said. And the worst part? She believed it. I stood on that porch in the dark, my coffee growing cold in my hands, and I didn't make a sound. Not because I was weak. Not because I was broken. Because I had been waiting, quietly, carefully, patiently, for 31 years. And the one person who had seen every single minute of that waiting? She had already made sure the whole world would know exactly who I was. Stay with me. Because what happened next, what was already waiting inside a fireproof box at the end of a locked hallway, will show you that silence is not the same thing as surrender. My name is Harold Easton. I am 62 years old, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades with my hands in the earth, first as a hired agronomist on other men's farms, and then as the quiet, unseen backbone of the most respected organic farming operation in Callaway County, Kentucky. I am not a man who asks for recognition. I never have been. I am a man who shows up before dawn, who reads a field the way some men read scripture, slowly, carefully, looking for what the land is trying to tell you. I am a man who fixed a catastrophic drainage failure in January mud while my wife was in Gatlinburg for a girls' weekend. I am a man who drove to a foster placement office one ordinary Thursday afternoon, signed the papers, and brought home a 5-year-old boy named Zach who was sitting in a plastic chair holding a paper bag that contained every single thing he owned in this world. I still think about that bag sometimes. I am also the man my wife described to her sisters, without hesitation, without guilt, as basically an employee. This is the story of what I did next. And why I never raised my voice once. People around Callaway County knew Marlene Bell the way you know a landmark. She was part of the geography itself, born on that farm, raised on it, buried her husband on it, and then spent the next 30 years transforming grief into something extraordinary. 340 acres of certified organic cropland, a co-op charter linking 12 participating farms, and a name that meant something at every farmer's market from Paducah to Louisville. When I first came to work her fields in the spring of 1991, I was 29 years old, a degree in agronomy in my pocket, a used pickup truck in the lot, and exactly no illusions about how hard this life was going to be. Marlene didn't hire me because I was impressive. She hired me because I showed up on time, asked smart questions, and didn't flinch when she told me the south drainage had been wrong for 6 years and every contractor she'd brought in had made it worse. I spent 4 full days walking that field with a level and a notebook before I said a single word about a solution. She watched me from the fence line the entire time, never called out, never interrupted. When I finally came back to her with a plan, she read through my notes twice, folded the pages with deliberate care, and said 2 words. Start Monday. That was how we worked for the next 3 decades. No speeches. No plaques. No news articles. Just the work, and the land, and a shared understanding that some things are too important for fanfare. Karen came into the picture about a year after I started. She drove out one Sunday afternoon, city shoes and all, to visit her mother, and I happened to be repairing a section of fence along the access road. We talked for 10 minutes. She was charming in the way people are when they are performing charm rather than actually feeling it. I was 30 years old. I mistook the flutter in my chest for instinct. I should have recognized it as a warning. We married in 1993. Marlene came to the wedding in a blue dress and sensible shoes and danced exactly once with me, a slow Patsy Cline song, and I thought about that dance more times than I can count over the years that followed. We had Chance in 92, Taylor in 97, and in 2003, when Karen's younger sister Alice and her husband were killed on I-24 during a November ice storm. 3 cars, a jackknife semi, 2 good people gone in under a minute. I drove to the foster placement office and brought Zach home on a Thursday. The other 2 sisters, Cindy and Rita, sent their regrets from a comfortable distance. Said they didn't have the room. Said the timing wasn't right. I didn't ask Karen twice. Marlene watched all of it. She didn't say much. She was never the type. But she watched everything. And then came the Friday in October that changed everything. The harvest was in. I came home that evening to find Karen, Cindy, and Rita already settled around the fire pit out back, wine glasses filled, voices loose with Chardonnay and anticipation. I didn't interrupt. I poured myself a cup of coffee in the kitchen and stepped out onto the side porch, which wraps around far enough that I could hear them clearly without being seen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I just needed some air. She can't last much longer, Cindy was saying. Dr. Parrish said 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Then we need to be ready, Rita replied, clipped and precise, even with half a bottle in her. I've already talked to Dalton. He says as long as the original will holds, we're looking at a 3-way split. Land, co-op shares, the house. All of it. Karen swirled her glass and leaned back in her chair like a woman who had already won. Harold's going to make a fuss, Cindy laughed. Let him fuss. What's he going to do? Nothing, Karen said. The word landed flat and certain, like she had already run the numbers and circled the answer in red. He's an employee, basically. Always has been. A pause. And then. I'll bleed his accounts dry before he even figures out which courthouse to walk into. She raised her glass toward her sisters. To Mom, she said. And to finally collecting what's ours. They drank. The fire popped. And I stood on that porch with my coffee going cold, and I did not move for a very long time. Employee. 31 years. A boy in a plastic chair with a paper bag. A drainage system rebuilt in January mud. Employee. I set the mug down on the porch railing without a sound. Walked inside. Past the living room. Up the stairs. To the small office I kept locked at the end of the hall. Inside the closet, behind a row of hanging winter coats, sat a fireproof box I had been quietly adding to for the better part of a decade. Deeds. Trust amendments. Proxy records. An email chain between Marlene and her original attorney going back to 2009. Photographs. Receipts. Notarized statements. I unlocked the box, pulled out a fresh legal pad, and sat down at my desk. 31 years of being the man nobody saw. They were about to see me. The secret in the fireproof box. 4 years before that October fire pit, on a grey January morning when the cold had gotten into the walls of the farmhouse itself, Marlene Bell had slid a folder across her kitchen table without a word of preamble. I updated my documents, she said simply. I opened the folder. Co-op charter amendments. A revised trustee designation. And a notarized addendum I read 3 times before I fully grasped what I was looking at. My name appeared in a clause I had helped draft years earlier, now expanded. Significantly expanded. Marlene, I started. She cut in, not unkindly, but with the quiet finality of a woman who had already done her thinking. You have been the only reliable person in this operation for 20 years. I am not going to apologize for recognizing that in writing. I closed the folder and held it in both hands. Karen will contest this, I told her. Marlene looked at me with those grey eyes that always seemed to be calculating 3 moves ahead. Karen doesn't know this version exists, she said. Norman does. The registry in Franklin County does. That's enough. She poured more coffee into both our cups. I've watched my girls long enough, she said quietly. I know what they'll do the moment I'm gone. I am not leaving this land to their appetites. I carried that folder home and locked it in the fireproof box behind the winter coats. I never mentioned it to Karen. I never mentioned it to anyone except Norman himself, when I called his office the following week to confirm every filing was properly in order. His voice was careful and unhurried when he answered. She was very specific about what she wanted, Harold. In 41 years of practice, I have rarely seen a client more clear-eyed. And now, 3 days after the fire pit, I was sitting in that same locked office after midnight, going through every page of that box. The amended trust. The co-op proxy assignment. The Franklin County Registry confirmation, stamped and dated. The photographs from the Eastfield rebuild, me knee-deep in January mud, Marlene at the fence line, watching. She had taken those photographs herself. I hadn't known that until the day she pressed them into my hands. And then, at the very bottom of the box, beneath everything else, was an envelope I had not put there. My name was on the front in Marlene's handwriting. Careful. Deliberate. The cursive of a woman who had learned penmanship before keyboards existed. I did not open it that night. Instead, I added one item to the box, my phone, with a new audio recording, 41 minutes of Karen, Cindy, and Rita talking beside the fire. Clear as a church bell. I'll bleed his accounts dry. I labeled the file, locked the box, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in years. 3 days after recording that conversation, I drove out to Marlene's farmhouse one last time while she was still alive. I brought a thermos of beef broth and a loaf of the sourdough she liked from the bakery on Route 68. Gloria, the home health aide who had been with her for 8 months, met me at the door and told me she was having a decent morning. At this stage, a decent morning counted as very good news. Marlene was in her high-backed chair by the window, a wool blanket across her lap, watching the east field through the glass. The field had been cut and tilled for winter. Clean rows running all the way to the tree line. She turned when she heard my boots on the hardwood. "You brought the sourdough," she said. Not a question. "Every time," I answered. We sat together for a long while without talking. A red-tailed hawk was working the fence line along the south edge. Neither of us pointed it out. Neither of us needed to. Finally, she asked without turning from the window, "Is the box still where it should be?" "It is," I replied. She nodded slowly. I added something. "Before Gloria moved in, when I could still get around the house on my own. You'll find it at the bottom." I thought of the envelope with my name on the front. "I know," I told her. She looked at me then, directly, with those grey eyes. "Karen came by last week with Dalton Reeves. Her attorney. She said the name the way you'd say bad weather. She had him explain the estate timeline to me, as if I were confused about my own affairs." My jaw tightened. "What did you do?" The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. I listened to every word. Then I told them I was tired and asked them to leave. She looked back at the field. Gloria showed them out. Karen didn't say goodbye. I reached over and touched her hand. "Marlene, if you want me to." "I don't want you to do anything yet," she said firmly. "Let them think it's going the way they expect. That's important. Norman has everything he needs. Leonard in the adjacent filing has the backup. The only thing left now is waiting." A pause. Then, more quietly, "And making sure Zach knows he's provided for." That landed harder than I expected. I looked at her. "He's in the amended co-op charter," she went on. "Not by name. By designation. The agronomist of record, which will be him once you formalize it. I had Norman write it that way on purpose. Clean. Unchallengeable." She picked up her mug. "That boy drove me to 4 doctor's appointments last spring. Did he tell you that?" He hadn't. I already knew what Zach would say, if I asked him. That it was no big deal. That she needed a ride. That it wasn't worth mentioning. That was how both of them operated. Quietly. Without expecting anything in return. I stayed 2 hours. We talked about the hawk. About the drainage improvements we'd made to the North Quadrant. About a co-op member named Dale Hutchkins who was thinking of retiring, and what that would mean for the spring contracts. Ordinary things. Real things. The kind of conversation that matters most when you know it might be one of the last ones. When I stood to go, Marlene looked up at me from her chair with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not soft, exactly, but settled. Complete. "You never asked for anything," she said. "In 30 years. "I didn't need to," I answered. "The work was enough." She nodded once, as if that confirmed something she had suspected for a very long time. I picked up my coat, walked to the door, and let myself out into the cold, grey afternoon. On the drive home, I called Norman's office. His assistant put me through immediately. "Norman, I need to confirm the Franklin County filing is properly cross-referenced with the co-op charter amendment." "It is," he answered without hesitation. "Triple-checked it myself last month, at Marlene's request. Every document points to the same conclusion. And if they try to contest on grounds of diminished capacity, a brief pause, Her physician filed a competency statement in September. Marlene insisted on it. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "I want it on record that I knew exactly what I was doing." I exhaled slowly and watched the county road unspool ahead of me. Bare trees. Grey sky. The kind of November afternoon that looks like the whole world is holding its breath. "Thank you, Norman." His voice was steady and certain. "Whatever happens next, Harold, you have a very solid foundation." The packages started arriving the following week. A slim white box from a jeweler. A set of Italian leather luggage. A monogrammed laptop case. A pair of boots that cost more than my first truck payment. Karen stopped bothering to carry them upstairs before I saw them. She'd leave the boxes stacked near the front door like a statement, receipts tossed on the entry table without a second glance. One evening, I picked up one of those receipts. The card number was from an account I didn't recognize. I set it back down exactly where I found it. The next morning, while Karen was at her Thursday book club, I sat down at my desk and pulled up the financial records I kept separately from our joint accounts. What I found was this: our joint checking account had dropped by nearly $14,000 over 4 months, in small, irregular withdrawals that didn't correspond to any household expense I could identify. Some were ATM pulls. Some were transfers to an account number I didn't recognize. None of them were large enough to trigger a flag. Together, they told a story. I printed the records, dated each page, and added them to the fireproof box. Then I called Carla Odom, a retired paralegal I had trusted for 15 years, a methodical and utterly discreet woman who had handled document work for 2 of the co-op's founding members. "I need a full asset trace," I told her. "Joint accounts, credit inquiries, anything filed in Karen's name in the last 5 years." She called back in 4 days. There was a credit card account opened in Karen's name alone, 18 months prior. Current balance, just under $11,000. And there was a savings account, in a bank 3 counties over, with a balance of $62,000, funded by systematic transfers going back nearly 3 years. $62,000. Quiet as a field mouse. Steady as a drip. I thanked Carla, documented everything, and locked the box. That evening, Karen came home from what she described as lunch with Cindy. She set a new handbag on the kitchen counter and looked at it with deep satisfaction, the particular satisfaction of a woman who believes she is getting away with something. Then she looked at me. "Mother's doing worse," she said, as if delivering a weather update. "Gloria thinks it's a matter of days." "I know," I said. "I was there Tuesday." Something crossed her face. Not grief. Not guilt. More like mild irritation at being reminded that I existed in that part of her world. She picked up the handbag and headed for the stairs. "Try not to make things complicated, Harold," she said over her shoulder. "When the time comes, just let the attorneys handle it." I watched her go. Let the attorneys handle it. I almost felt sorry for Dalton Reeves. Almost. The day silence finally spoke. Marlene Bell died on a Tuesday morning in early November. Quietly. The way she had done most things. Gloria called me at 6:43 a.m. I was already dressed. I drove out to the farmhouse before Karen was awake, stood in the doorway of Marlene's bedroom for a long moment, and said goodbye in the way I had been rehearsing in my head for months, silently, with my hand on the door frame and the grey morning light coming through the curtains. Then I made the calls that needed making. The funeral home. Norman's office. The co-op's administrative coordinator, Bev, who had worked alongside Marlene for 18 years and received the news in silence before thanking me and quietly hanging up. I did all of it from Marlene's kitchen, the same table where we had reviewed documents and talked about drainage systems and drunk more cups of coffee than I could count. Karen arrived at 9:30 with Cindy and Rita. She cried in the driveway, loudly, briefly, and then walked into the house and began assessing the furniture. I went back to the farm. The funeral was held 4 days later at First Methodist, a building Marlene had attended for 61 years. 40 people came. Co-op members. Neighbors. The church secretary who had organized Marlene's Wednesday Bible study for a decade. Dale Hutchkins, who was thinking of retiring, came with his wife and stayed for every minute of the service. Mr. and Mrs. Arbuckle from the adjacent property, both in their 80s, sat in the third pew and wept without embarrassment, the honest grief of people who had known someone well enough to miss them fully. Karen wore designer black and worked the room near the flower arrangements with the focused energy of someone running for office. At one point, I heard her tell the pastor's wife that her mother had been her closest confidant and that she planned to honor her legacy with everything she had. The pastor's wife nodded politely. She had known Marlene well enough to pass that. Zach sat with Taylor and me near the back. He didn't perform grief. He sat with his hands folded and his jaw set, the way he had learned, since that Thursday afternoon in a foster office with a paper bag on his lap, to absorb hard things quietly and completely, without theater. At one point, he leaned toward me and said in a low voice, "She knew, didn't she? Everything she was doing, she knew exactly why she did it." "She did," I told him. He nodded and looked back to the front of the church. Chance arrived late, slid into the pew beside Taylor, and spent most of the service with his arms crossed and his eyes on Karen. At the reception afterward, he pulled me aside near the coat rack. "Mom says the will reading is next week." His tone was careful but loaded, the tone he used when delivering a message on someone else's behalf. "She says things are going to be straightforward. She says you shouldn't expect complications." I looked at my son for a long moment. 33 years old. Smart enough to know he was being used as a messenger. Choosing to do it anyway. "Tell your mother," I said calmly, "that I'm not expecting anything. I'm just going to show up." After the reception, as the parking lot cleared, I noticed Dalton Reeves near the side entrance in a dark coat, talking quietly with Karen. He was 39, carried himself like a man who had never been surprised by anything. I watched him nod at something she said. He had no idea what was in Norman's office. No idea what was filed in Franklin County. No idea whose name was typed into the margin of a document he hadn't seen yet. Norman Hartley's conference room was unremarkable. A long table, tall windows, the smell of old wood and older decisions. Karen arrived with Cindy and Rita on one side of her, Dalton Reeves on the other. Chance was there. Taylor sat beside me. Zach stood near the back wall with his hands in his pockets. Dalton had brought a folder. I noticed he didn't open it. Norman set his reading glasses on his nose, cleared his throat, and began. He read through the standard provisions. The farmhouse contents. Personal effects. A small bequest to First Methodist. Karen was already leaning slightly forward in her chair. Then Norman said, "Regarding the land, the co-op charter, and all associated assets, the estate is governed by the amended trust filed in Franklin County on March 14, 2020, and the associated addenda dated through August of this year." Karen's head tilted slightly. Norman kept reading. Under the amended trust, the 340 acres of farmland were placed into a protected agricultural trust, managed jointly by Harold Easton as primary trustee, and Zachary Easton as the designated agronomist of record, with full succession rights. The co-op shares were transferred to the trust, not to individual heirs. Karen's three-way split, land, co-op shares, house, all of it, existed only in an original will that Marlene had superseded, legally and completely, for years prior. Dalton Reeves finally opened his folder. But I had watched Norman prepare for this moment for 4 years. Every filing cross-referenced. Every amendment notarized and registered. Marlene's physician's competency statement, signed in September, on record. Dalton Reeves had brought a folder. Norman had brought a fortress. Karen turned to look at me from across the table. I met her eyes and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. That evening, I finally opened Marlene's letter. It was 3 pages, handwritten, in that careful deliberate cursive of hers. She wrote about the farm, about what it had cost her to build it and what she had hoped it would become. She wrote about Zach, and the afternoon she had watched him from her kitchen window, walking the north field with a notebook, measuring the sky the way a farmer does when he is listening to the land. And then, near the end, she wrote this. "Harold, you never asked me for a single thing. In 30 years, you never asked. You just worked, and you showed up, and you stayed. That is rarer than land. Rarer than money. Rarer than almost anything I have ever witnessed. I have tried, in what ways I had available to me, to make sure the world treats you accordingly. The rest is up to you. Take care of the farm. Take care of Zach. And for heaven's sake, take a day off once in a while. I sat at my desk for a long time after I finished reading. The house was quiet. Outside, the November fields were dark and still. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and put it at the very top of the fireproof box. Then I locked the box, turned off the light, and went to bed. The land was still there in the morning. It always would be. The lesson this story leaves behind. Harold Easton never raised his voice. He never made threats. He never begged for recognition or stormed into a room demanding what was his. He simply did the work, steadily, faithfully, year after year, and he documented it. Every deed, every photo, every email, every receipt. And when the moment came, the truth didn't need him to speak at all. It had already spoken. The lesson is this: integrity is not what you perform when people are watching. It is what you build when nobody is. The people who underestimated Harold saw a man who was quiet, overlooked, easy to dismiss. They saw an employee. What they missed was that quiet people who do the real work, and document it, and persevere, and refuse to be bitterness poisoned, have a way of outlasting everyone who underestimated them. Marlene Bell understood something that Karen never did, that the value of a person is measured not by how loudly they claim credit, but by what falls apart the moment they stop showing up. Harold never stopped showing up. And in the end, the land, and the truth, stayed exactly where they belonged. Speech Balloon, if this story moved you, please subscribe and leave a comment below telling us. Was there ever a time in your life when staying quiet was actually your greatest strength? Your stories matter. Your presence here matters. And we'll see you in the next one. With gratitude, Red Heart.